Hi, fifth grade readers. You should be logged into Illuminate and looking at the same passage that I'm showing on the screen. So, you are taking our mastery quiz. This is one passage and 11 questions. I'm going to read the passage and then I will also read aloud each question. You can use as much or as little of this recording as you would like. A remarkable road trip. Paragraph 1. On the evening of May 19, 1903, Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson accepted a challenge to do something that nobody had done before. The terms of this challenge included driving from San Francisco, California to New York City in 90 days. If he succeeded, he would win $50. Paragraph 2. Although today it is not unusual to drive across the country in just a few days, this was not always the case. The automobile was a new product in 1903, and cars were not as advanced as today's vehicles. In 1903, many believed that cars were a luxury and a source of entertainment rather than a useful means of transportation. Horse-drawn carriages were considered more dependable. Jackson, however, wanted to prove that cars could be just as useful and reliable. We're now in the section preparing for the trip. Paragraph 3. Jackson hired mechanic Sewell K. Crocker to join him on the cross-country drive. Crocker suggested that Jackson buy a Winton touring car for the journey. Jackson took Crocker's suggestion under advisement and bought the car used from a banker in San Francisco. Paragraph 4. Because gas stations did not exist in those days, Jackson decided to carry tanks of gasoline, which would be refilled at general stores along the way. Jackson also bought other supplies and equipment for the journey. To make room for supplies, Crocker removed the car's back seat. Take note of this box and this list of some of Jackson's supplies, this text feature. Cooking equipment, sleeping bags, a car cover, warm clothing, tools, rope, a camera, and a spare tire. Now we're in this section, a difficult journey. Paragraph 5. On May 23, 1903, in the early afternoon, Jackson and Crocker left San Francisco. They had driven only 15 miles when a rear tire became flat. Luckily, they were able to use the spare tire for the rest of that day's journey. Paragraph 6. Another problem Jackson and Crocker encountered was getting accurate directions. In 1903, there were no road maps, and travel guidebooks were published for only certain parts of the country. Advice from strangers, a compass, and landmarks such as railroad tracks and mountains helped guide the men. Sometimes the directions they received were incorrect, and they had to turn around and locate the correct route. At other times, Jackson was forced to change course to avoid flooded or snow-covered land. Paragraph 7. In addition, in 1903, there were only about 150 miles of paved roads across the country. Most roads were dirt paths that had been used mainly for horse-drawn carriages. In remote areas where roads did not exist at all, Jackson drove through muddy cow pastures and even over mountains. The bumpy ride sometimes jarred equipment loose and caused it to fall off the car. They also experienced many flat tires and dead batteries. Paragraph 8. Finding tires and other car parts for repairs were difficult. In 1903, there were only 850 Winton vehicles in the country. Replacement parts had to be ordered directly from the Winton car factory and delivered by stagecoach or train. Jackson wisely ordered a new car part ahead of time so that they'd be waiting for him when he arrived in the next town. Then he would have to find a blacksmith to install parts. Some generously worked overnight to help the men. We're in the next section called the positive side. Paragraph 9. Jackson and Crocker's journey was not entirely filled with difficulties. One thing that kept the trip enjoyable was Bud, a bulldog Jackson had bought in California. Bud became the team's mascot, traveling with the men wherever they went. Jackson even put goggles on Bud to keep the dust out of his eyes. The dog was a source of joy to Jackson and Crocker, who would gaze over and see a happy Bud riding alongside them. By the journey's end, Bud was a celebrity. Make sure you look at this text feature. This looks like a magazine or like a cover of some type of article that shows Bud with his goggles on. Paragraph 10. Local newspapers reported on the team's progress as they passed through each town, and neighboring towns became aware of the team's upcoming arrival. Residents came to see the men in their Winton, greeting them with cheers. The event was especially exciting since many people had never seen a car before. Again, take note of this picture. The caption says Jackson, Crocker, and Bud in the Winton touring car. Next section, mission complete. Paragraph 11. Jackson, Crocker, and Bud reached New York City on July 26, 1903. The team completed the journey in 63 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes. It is estimated, paragraph 12, it is estimated that the team had driven more than 5,600 miles. Although Jackson won $50, he spent a total of $8,000 on the trip. Paragraph 13. Was it worth the cost? Jackson believes so. Jackson and Crocker's success changed American driving forever. The idea that people could travel long distances in a vehicle became a reality. Jackson was able to see many beautiful parts of the country and dreamed that one day others would be able to experience America's landscape just as he had. Today, Jackson's Winton is displayed in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., taking its rightful place in history. If you would like, you can stop here and listen to the passage again. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to reading the questions. Number 1, the author informs the reader about Jackson's journey mainly by A, sharing Jackson's thoughts as he traveled. B, listing the supplies that Jackson loaded into his car. C, describing the difficulties and successes of Jackson's trip. D, explaining how much money Jackson's trip cost. How did the author inform the reader about the journey? Mainly by doing what? Question 2. The reader can conclude that people came to see Jackson and Crocker during their trip because people were F, interested in hearing news about nearby towns. G, curious to see what the vehicle looked like. H, eager to sell them supplies for their trip. J, hoping to join them on their trip. Question 3. The photograph of Bud next to paragraph 9 helps the reader understand that the dog, A, was a rare breed at that time, B, had traveled for most of its life, C, became famous as a result of the trip, D, guided Jackson and Crocker on their trip. Paragraph 4. Question 4. What is the main idea of the selection? F. In 1903, paved roads were rare in the United States, but they became more common after Jackson and Crocker drove across the country. G. In 1903, Jackson and Crocker drove a car across the United States and found that cars had many problems. H. In 1903, many Americans had never before seen a car until Jackson and Crocker drove across the country. J. In 1903, Jackson and Crocker drove a car across the United States, which was a great accomplishment at that time. Question 5. A compare and contrast pattern is used to organize the ideas in paragraph 2, mainly to A. Explain how the problems of car travel were different from other methods of travel in 1903. B. Describe the differences regarding car travel between 1903 and today. C. Show differences between Jackson's decisions and those made by Crocker. D. Emphasize how the events of 1903 affected Jackson's trip. If at any time you want to pause this and look at the passage, I would highly recommend going to the paragraphs that they're telling you to look for answers. Question 6. The subheadings help the reader understand that the selection focuses mainly on F. The progress of Jackson's trip across the country. G. The reason Jackson was interested in cars. H. The purpose of the challenge Jackson accepted. J. The way that cars changed during Jackson's lifetime. Question 7. What effect did Jackson's trip have on American society? A. Sales of Winton cars increased. B. Newspapers became more popular. C. People changed their ideas about the usefulness of cars. D. People traveled to many unexplored parts of the country. Question 8. What does the word remote mean in paragraph 7? Don't forget to use your online dictionary. F, lacking tourist attractions. G, far from populated areas. H, difficult to see from a distance. J, familiar to a particular group of people. Question 9. What is the best summary of the section titled A Difficult Journey? Don't forget to go to that section, only A Difficult Journey, and reread it. A, Jackson and Crocker left San Francisco, and after only 15 miles of driving, their rear tire went flat. They were able to use a spare tire for the rest of that day. They had trouble getting accurate directions at times, and bad weather was also an obstacle to completing their journey. B, Jackson and Crocker encountered many difficulties on their journey. Sometimes they got lost, their car frequently needed repairs, and they encountered harsh weather. They planned well, though, and received help when they needed it. C, when Jackson and Crocker left San Francisco, they could not predict what would happen to them in the next 3 months. During their journey, they drove on many dirt paths. People helped the two men repair their car when it broke down from the rough travel. D, when Jackson and Crocker drove across the country, the land was difficult to cross. The roads were bumpy and fields were often muddy. Bad weather made travel even more difficult and caused the car to break down at times. Question 10. Based on information in the selection, what can the reader infer about American society in 1903? F, most people did not travel far from the towns in which they lived. G, many people disliked the changes brought about by new inventions. H, many people opposed the idea of the government building roads. J, the automobile had replaced the need for most farm animals. Question 11. Which idea is supported by the photograph after paragraph 10? Go look at the photograph after paragraph 10. A, Jackson had to make many repairs to the car as he traveled. B, Jackson refilled his gasoline tanks at general stores along his trip. C, Jackson traveled a great distance between stops along his trip. D, Jackson was welcomed by crowds when he arrived in a new town. Teammates, please make sure that you are taking your time, that you're going back to the passage in order to get evidence for each answer choice you choose over here on the right. When you're completely done, you're going to hit review and finish test, and then tell me finished in the chat. Good luck.